Hi guys, I am back to talk about terrestrial biomes, and we kind of talked about the importance of the relationship between an area's climate and the living organisms that will be able to survive there in an ecosystem community. And so now we're going to kind of go through and think about what are the major different terrestrial ecosystems, aka terrestrial biomes, that we have on our planet. So let me share my screen. Okay, so first of all, when you're reading chapter 16 in the textbook, this is Earth's major terrestrial biomes section is the kind of major section in the chapter, and that's the section that we're going to focus on. There's a section before that, and I actually forget what the name of it is. It's pretty short. It's about invasive species and whatnot, but we're not really going to get into that, so you can skip over that one. Okay, so as we had defined before, a biome is a large-scale ecosystem. Okay, so ecosystems can be small, but a biome is always, by definition, covering a large area. We usually define boundaries between biomes by the plant communities that exist there. Animals migrate, plants don't, so they're kind of an easy visual indicator of where climatic conditions are changing on the landscape. They're terrestrial, so important ecosystems in the ocean are not considered biomes, although they are, of course, important ecosystems. And then because of this close link between climate, the importance of climate in determining adaptations that organisms may have, and the importance of climate in determining the potential photosynthetic rate and then productivity rate and biomass that might exist in a particular area, the boundaries between different biomes are closely linked to the boundaries between different Köppen climate zones that we covered previously. Okay, so when we think about defining what a biome is and where one biome starts and stops, there's a couple things that we can look at. So first of all, we look at types of vegetation. So of course, since these biomes are very large scale, they exist across large areas and perhaps even on different continents or in different hemispheres, where different organisms have different evolutionary ancestors. And so we're not going to have the exact same species in each biome or each example of a specific biome, but we'll have similar types of vegetation. So grasses as opposed to shrubs, as opposed to trees. So these are kinds of different types of plant and animal groups that have been adapted to live in the types of climates where we find certain biomes existing. We also think about the density of the vegetation. So where there's lots of vegetation packed together, that's usually an indication that there's plenty of water for all those plants to be able to grow and not kind of compete with each other over water, or potentially plenty of sunlight to support photosynthesis. We also think about productivity of these landscapes. So productivity is also related to photosynthesis. It's basically how fast photosynthesis is happening in a particular biome. And the faster the photosynthesis is happening, the faster the plants are growing and the more biomass they're building. So biomass is basically what it sounds like, the weight or the mass of the living organisms, the biology in an area. And so where the biomass is really high in some place like a tropical rainforest, that means there's been lots of photosynthesis, lots of productivity. It's a very high productivity area. And that is also, of course, linked to climate, because there must have been plenty of water, plenty of sunlight, and adequate temperature to support that productivity. And then a final characteristic I want to mention is biodiversity. So biodiversity is kind of described as the number of different species, or maybe the number of different groups of animals. Maybe it's not necessarily defined on a species basis, but on like a family of animal basis or different genera of animal basis. And I guess I should also say it's not necessarily associated with animals, could be plant groups or total different kinds of organisms of all different kingdoms within living organisms. But it's basically the number of different kinds of organisms that we have living in an area. And certain areas are more diverse and certain areas are less diverse. One trend that we generally see in biodiversity is that areas in the tropics are much more diverse than as areas at higher latitude. So this is a map that's showing plant biodiversity. And so you can see kind of hot zones are in like the Amazon and in Central America, warmer zones within some of the rainforest areas in Africa, certainly in areas like Indonesia, up into some of the parts of Southeast Asia and China, Mediterranean, somewhat high as well. But generally, these are areas that, one, just have a little bit more of a conducive climate to support productivity. And the more growth there is, the more biodiversity there tends to be. But also we know that a lot of the areas at more northern and southern latitudes were affected by glaciers during the more recent ice ages. And that was something that was very disruptive to ecosystems, wiped out a lot of ecosystems. And so those ecosystems are basically being recolonized over the last 10 or 20,000 years, whereas a lot of these tropical ecosystems have been a lot more stable over more like millions of years. And so that's another thing that probably contributes to their diversity. So anyway, this biodiversity is something that we look at along with general organismal structure, density, productivity, et cetera, to kind of define where one biome starts and where another one stops. Okay, so this is the biome map from your book. And I actually just took a picture of it right out of the book. I couldn't access the nice online image, but this is in your textbook. And basically it shows a range of different biomes that exist. A lot of these biomes are, again, kind of falling along lines of certain ranges of latitude. And then also they might have a component where a certain biome might be more likely to exist like on an east coast or a west coast of our continent, where we've learned there's differences in humidity and precipitation related to some ocean current issues, or maybe they exist in more interior places on continents where they're not in contact with oceans and humidity and are probably drier and experiencing greater temperature ranges associated with these interior areas that aren't close to the high specific heat of water that kind of tempers more coastal climates. So anyway, we're going to go through in detail each of the different biomes that are listed in this map, starting kind of at the equator and then working outward. So on the key here in this map, the tropical rainforest is the first biome, and so that's the first biome that we're going to talk about. Okay, so this is a picture of the tropical rainforest. Sometimes this is called the equatorial tropical rainforest, although all tropical rainforests exist along the equator, so that's a little bit of a redundant term here. And these areas tend to be filled with, first of all, lots of trees. Some of these trees are very tall, but there's also trees of all different heights that fill up all the different parts of the canopy. But it's not just trees, it's also lots of vines and epiphytes, which are different plants that grow on the surface of other trees. So I have some impatiens and bromeliads shown growing on a tree trunk here. Ferns, all different kinds of things that are completely filling in and making a very, very dense type of ecosystem. This very dense ecosystem is filled with an enormous diversity of organisms. Some estimates say that the tropical rainforests occupy only about 3% of the land area on the planet, but probably are home to about 50% of the species on the planet. So very, very diverse area. And then also very productive. So we've already learned that these areas along the equator are very hot. There's lots of direct sunlight, concentrated sunlight. There's plenty of water. And so these areas are going to be like bastions for photosynthesis, and therefore very productive. And when we're kind of thinking about why we have a certain biome in a certain place, it's important to kind of think back to our Köppen climate system. And so one of the Köppen climate zones that we talked about was the tropical humid zone. So this definitely falls within the tropical humid zone. And then within that zone, you may remember there was different kind of subzones. And so the tropical rainforest would fall most particularly within kind of what's sometimes called the tropical rainforest, or the tropical wet part of the tropics, which is really kind of in this true equatorial, very wet, very rainy very, very hot area. Okay, so then as we move a little bit farther out from the equator, we encounter another biome, and I'm noticing I guess it is shown here. The biome is called the tropical seasonal forest, sometimes also referred to as the tropical scrub. And this is an area that is a little bit farther from the equator. And so as a result, it still is hot and still has water and rain, but probably experiences some seasonal dry period. So as the Earth rotates around the equator, we know that it gets kind of closer and farther from that solar radiation that can create some seasonality. And so these areas that are farther from the equator are going to feel that influence more. And because all of these areas are still fairly close to the equator, the big impact to organisms is less about a change in temperature that's associated with seasons, but more about a change in precipitation that might be associated with these seasons. So these areas might be kind of getting a little bit closer to a higher pressure zone during part of the year that might cause them to be a little bit drier. And as a result, there's probably vegetation that is still denser than some biomes, but less dense than the tropical rainforest. They might have shorter trees and some more shrubs as opposed to just trees. They're still going to be productive, again, relative to some other areas on the planet, but just not quite the same as that true tropical kind of equatorial rainforest. And their biodiversity is also going to be kind of lower as well. So this is another type of tropical forest, but has some different characteristics compared to the equatorial forest that we just mentioned. Okay, so as we kind of go through these different biomes, one of the things that the chapter does, and one of the things that I'm going to do as well, is kind of think about what are some of the anthropogenic, meaning human-caused factors that may be influencing the scale of how these biomes exist. So in geography, we're very interested in looking at kind of the spatial patterns, like where things are and why they're there. And of course, humans, with 7.5 billion of us living on the planet now, with lots of technology, lots of ability to quickly move around and transform ecosystems, are changing the scale and pattern of lots of different ecosystems and biomes on our planet. And so we're going to kind of think about those influences. And so in the tropical forest systems, one of the main impacts is that humans are rapidly cutting down forests. And in particular, we're rapidly cutting down tropical forests. This is happening at a much faster rate than we're cutting down temperate and other kinds of forests that we'll talk about later. So this deforestation of the tropical rainforest and tropical seasonal forests is leading to kind of an expansion of more scrublands and savanna type of ecosystems that we'll talk about later. A lot of this is being done for agriculture, which we'll mention in a minute. But the rate that this is happening in places like the Amazon that I have shown here, but also in places like Africa, and especially in places like tropical parts of Asia, is really astounding. So certain estimates have pinned this at 40 football fields every single second. So like a second goes by really fast. That adds up to a lot of area being cleared. Another estimate would say the area of Washington State every single year. So if you imagine we have the United States, and then over a 20-year period, 20 Washington states were completely cleared of forests. That would cut through a huge portion of our country being completely cleared in a very short period of time. So these is a really, really rapid process that's having massive impacts on certainly this particular ecosystem, but also global climate and function and other things like that. And another thing that's important to notice is that these particular ecosystems tend to have soils that are really old. We mentioned before that a lot of other ecosystems are kind of being recolonized and reforming after the last ice ages, and the tropical systems are much older. And so that has allowed them to build up a lot of biodiversity, but it has caused a lot of leaching of nutrients from the soil. So the soils themselves are not very rich. When the natural tropical forest systems are in place, As leaves fall off trees and animals poop, they create this big kind of mulch or compost layer on the surface of the soil that provides a lot of nutrients. But after deforestation happens, a lot of times what people do is they burn off that layer to access the soil below. And then what they find is that the soil below is very kind of poor nutrient, and it's really not very good at supporting agriculture. So people might grow things for a few years, and then the productivity of the soil really drops off, and then they have to move into a new area of the forest. And so a lot of this agriculture that's being practiced in these areas is cattle, kind of grazing cattle, and then growing soy and palm. And a lot of this is for export to parts of the developed world that have a big demand for these types of products. So unfortunately, as these areas are being deforested, we're finding that it's difficult to kind of return to these ecosystems on any kind of type of human time scale, and probably a time scale that's much longer than humans are around. So why do we value these forests so much? Well, a couple of different reasons would be, one, the biodiversity that's here. There's a lot of different reasons that we care about biodiversity on the planet, well, and I'm not going to get into all of them now. But as I mentioned a little bit earlier, many estimates are that about 50% of all the species that live on the planet live in these tropical forest systems. And so just for an example, these are not things you need to know or memorize, but Brazil has an average of 497 different trees per hectare. So a hectare is like the metric system version of an acre. And it's actually almost closer to like 2 acres, so about the size of 2 football fields. If you walked around in the Amazon forest, you would come across 500 different species of tree in that area, whereas the US and Canada combined only have 700 different kinds of trees total. So a big discrepancy in diversity. Also, there's more bird species per square mile in the Amazon than there are in all of North America, so Mexico, US, and Canada combined. And then there's a range of estimates about how many species we're losing. It's a complicated thing for us to understand for a variety of reasons that we're not going to get into now. But estimates range between about 25 species per day and 135 species every single day. So over a year or a decade, this is adding up to a huge loss in biodiversity associated with this habitat loss. And then another really important thing is that we've learned a lot about greenhouse gases. If we have carbon in the atmosphere, it contributes to warming climates, which have a variety of impacts that we'll talk more about later. But one effective way to keep carbon out of the atmosphere is to have photosynthesis take place in the place where it happens most rapidly on the planet, and that is in tropical forest systems. But if tropical forest systems are removed, we don't have this avenue that pulls carbon out of the atmosphere and captures it on the ground in living systems and in soils. So those are two of the reasons that we're concerned about tropical forest loss and deforestation. Okay, so moving on, the next biome that I want to mention is called the tropical savanna. Sometimes you'll hear people call this tropical grasslands. We've all seen pictures of this. Many of us have not had the opportunity to go and see this in person. But this is also featured in things like The Lion King, which I imagine many of you have seen. And these are these open grasslands in places like Africa, but also in other parts of the world that are very hot and have some rain, but have much higher seasonality than other parts of the world closer to the tropics. So as a result, they experience a distinct seasonal drought. That seasonal drought is often sometimes associated with like fires that were featured in The Lion King. But mostly as a result of the drier climate and the long periods of drought, this ecosystem is too dry to support trees or even shrubs, certainly on a wide scale or a high density scale. And so we have grass. And something to just keep in mind as we're going through these biomes is when we have open biomes and grassland biomes, that's usually an indication that there's not enough water in that place to support trees. So it's going to be a drier place. But on the other hand, what's interesting about this particular ecosystem is the openness of it allows for really different kinds of other organisms. So the African savanna is famous for being home to these large herds of all kinds of interesting animals, zebras and elephants and giraffes, et cetera, et cetera. And so these organisms are able to move around in this open space, and they don't exist in places like the tropical rainforest that would be way too dense to support and facilitate the movement and the survival of these types of animals. So again, different ecosystems are not better or worse, they're just different from each other. And while we have greater biodiversity in the tropical rainforest and other places, overall on the planet, we have the greatest biodiversity. We have many different functioning ecosystems, right? Because there's a different set of species that live in the savanna compared to the seasonal forest, compared to the tropical rainforest. And so we want to maintain all of these systems to have our overall global biodiversity be highest. So anyway, this is a tropical savanna, which is a third biome. Okay, so I think I showed you the same image in the climate zone talk, but I kind of want to point out that we've kind of been building our knowledge base throughout the semester. We learned about rising and sinking air, low and high pressure zones, and then we learned about moisture and where it rains and where it doesn't rain. And so one of the things that we know is that in the low pressure zone around the tropics, it's hot and it's wet, okay? And that supports these forest systems. And then as we move farther away from the tropics and approach these 30-degree subtropical high pressure zones, where air from the Hadley cells is sinking, we know that sinking air compresses air. The air from the higher altitude starts to compress. It starts to actually warm up. It's cool at elevation, but as it comes down to the surface, it starts to warm, which really prevents any moisture that's left from coming out of the air. So these areas are very dry. And so we haven't even gotten to the deserts yet. We'll talk about those next, but we've already kind of moved from a tropical rainforest system to a seasonal forest system to a savanna system. And so we've seen there's this distinct transition in the height and the density of the vegetation as we change between these kind of low and high pressure systems that are impacting the type of weather and climate that we see in these regions. Okay. So with that, we're going to move on to the next biome, biome number 4. And this is actually shown a little farther down on the biome key if you go back to one of the first slides. But it's kind of the next thing that we would counter as we're moving out from the equator towards a higher latitude. And this is the deserts. Okay, desert has 1 S, deserts has 2 S, because you like more dessert. And you may not like more desert, although of course the desert has its own beauty. But as most people know, the desert is kind of characterized by its limited vegetation. It's very dry. It's often very hot, but doesn't always have to be super hot all the time. Can have cold temperatures in the desert, particularly in the winter or at nighttime. But what's really characterizes the vegetation here is the low density of the vegetation. It's very spread out, and the vegetation has to have extreme adaptations to deal with lack of water because there's kind of extreme low water access. And the deserts are huge. They're one of the largest biomes. Over 1/3 of the Earth's land area is covered in deserts. Humans often don't spend a lot of time in the deserts because they're difficult for us to get some of the resources that we need there, but they are very expansive. And as we've already discussed, what characterizes them is the low density of vegetation and then the low productivity. So the vegetation that does grow in these areas grows very slowly, and that's because while there may be plenty of sunlight and adequate temperature, there's a real lack of water, which is that other kind of third component that's required for photosynthesis. So when we talked about the Köppen climate zones, we mentioned that one of the climate zones was called the kind of the dryland climate. Sometimes it's referred to as the arid zone. And then even within that, there is kind of 2 sub-zones or subcategories within that. one called the deserts and one called the semi-arid steppe. And so this is the kind of desert, the driest part of the dryland climates. Okay, then we have what are usually referred to as mid-latitude or sometimes temperate grasslands. And so these, in some ways, mimic the tropical savanna grasslands that we talked about before, but they're usually at higher latitude. So we usually have tropical grasslands kind of between the equator and the deserts, and then the mid-latitude grasslands between the poles and the desert. So kind of these grasslands are surrounding the deserts, sort of. And these tend to be very fertile in terms of a grassland system, but not as high productivity or density as forest systems that we've talked about before. We already said when we see these big open areas, it's because there's not enough water to support the photosynthetic rate that would be required to support trees. Also, like these open areas in the tropical savanna, these open areas are supportive of large animals and large herds of animals. In places like the United States and in other parts of the world, humans have done a pretty successful job of removing a lot of the native species of large herding animals that would have naturally existed in these locations. But we know about bison in the United States, and these are the kinds of things that would have been corollaries to the large herds of animals that still exist in the tropical savannas of Africa. So these are going to be generally more seasonal than the tropical grasslands. They're going to have warm summers, but much colder winter temperatures because they're much farther from the equator. And these also fall within the Köppen dryland systems, okay, or arid zones. But as we just mentioned, if you recall back to our Köppen climate zone lecture, there's actually two kind of subcategories within the Köppen dryland systems, and they are the deserts, which is where we find the desert biome, and then there's the semi-arid steppe climate, which is where we find these grasslands. Okay, I'm gonna give you guys a break, and then I'm gonna record the next set in the next video.